Welcome to KANTL for the 4th edition of Made in China Festival. Today we put the spotlights on Chinese poetry in collaboration with Poëziecentrum Gent. The festival started 3 weeks ago with an expo on Chinese comics and graphic art at Lucas School of Arts. In Swing Cinema, a variety of Chinese movies was shown touching different themes and topics of Chinese society. And last Sunday, the Migrant, a beautiful venue in Ghent, was filled with short movies, documentaries, virtual reality, a debate, all about contemporary China and Chinese culture. And tomorrow evening there will be our last event of this year's edition, with a talk about the Chinese classical novel, Dream of the Red Chamber, and followed by a debate on Chinese women in society now and then. Made in China Festival has a small mission. Our goal is to slowly open up a world that is unknown to us here in the West through culture, to enrich ourselves and to reach a better mutual understanding and cooperation in the future. So, this being said, I am very happy to welcome your host of tonight, Nicky Aerts, on stage. She will guide you through the evening filled with Chinese poetry.
Good evening from my part, everybody. So happy to see that you all made it here on a Tuesday evening, despite this ungodly weather. Anyways, and to come and listen to poetry, Chinese poetry, Chinese contemporary poetry, and a special selection of poems from China, battler poetry. I had never heard of it, to be honest. We have a few things going on here tonight, so like Ivia already told you, there's a lot of stuff still happening during the festival. Better get started. We're launching a new collection of poems by Zheng. I'm not going to pronounce her other name, the other part of her name, because I will not be able to do that correctly. A new collection translated by Sylvia Marijnissen, who is here tonight. She's sitting in the front row, and she'll be joining us later on for drinks, so you can ask her questions, so please do so. Sylvia will be happy to answer any question you have. Als IJzer zo stil, we will also sell this collection of poems afterwards. But we will first listen to Zheng herself reading a few poems. It's the easiest way, the best way to get to know poetry is by listening to the poet who wrote the poems. I'll give the floor, well, the word, pass the word on to Zheng.
灰色的巨大的耕地，连过它暮色的梦，怦然轰鸣，摇动。弯曲的铁片跌落在祭台上的细光，它冤家耸起。空荡荡的下午，它有过的受孕的绿色的梦，从寥寥升起的灰色铁块穿行而过，无数块在钢钉上扭曲的铁，他目睹它，只是被挤压的铁中的一块，沿着打工的祭台望去，成型在模糊的旋转中，在声光的交织间，它被生活不断的磨擦洗，它无法拒绝那些巨大的外力烘烤与锻炼，最后他目睹自己被滚烫的钢片落上和格。我说着这些多次的有力的语主体，沉默的公母的语，不是宁静的语， 批评的责任，以及圣经一样的语言，凶猛的、哭泣的、不幸的、疼痛饥饿的语言，基本上不明者的清醒职业语言，断指的语言，生活的底座的语言，在事业的暗处，钢筋潮湿的缝隙间，这些悲伤的语言，我亲身念着它，在机器的轰鸣间，黝黑的语言、汗液的语言、铁锈的语言，正如年轻武工无助的眼神，或者厂门口工伤的劳工，他们疼痛的语言、站立的身体的语言，没有得到赔偿的伤残手指的语言，内在锈迹斑斑的开关卡住法律制度，我说着黑血烘烤的语言，身份、年龄、疾病资本、恐惧嚎叫的语言，税关与小利益，工厂主暂住证外来工的语言，跳楼秀的语言， GDP 的语言，政绩工程的语言，孩子学费的语言，我说着石头加班暴力的语言，我说着深渊生活的楼梯，剩下不可琢磨的远方，在徒劳的风中紧紧抓住生活的栏杆的语言，我说着这些多刺的有力的语言，他们所有的刺都张开，刺痛这柔软的时代。虚荣，人生在美的意义中被虚妄出无数意义。面对死亡灰暗的时代，尽管那个样子，我依然对生命充满辉煌的敬意。是它让我目睹城市最奇妙的风景，我读这些女人的命运，为着我自己。工业蛀空的肉体、灵魂，我们过早失去自身，被消解在现实中，剩下疾病、断指、伤口残存时代的记忆。我写下这些句子的时候，你苍白的面容呈现身体的孱弱，头昏心悸，呼吸能艰难。你慢慢在适应工业时代带来的病痛。胶水本在血管纠缠，可怕的不是肉体的疼痛，乃至社会的疾病。无数和你相同命运的人，他们不晓得病根，从别人的城市回到自己的乡村，饱受疾病的折磨，默默死去，成为无声的部分。工业还是以自己的方式呈现虚荣的风景，社会还沉醉于无法诠释的繁荣的托起，衰弱的躯体，从工厂到职业病鉴定中心，到环保中心，到劳动部门，你忍受社会和身体双重疾病的折磨。药片在你的血管里头流动，它暂时扼住疾病的咽喉，社会的疾病仍在继续溃烂下去，从一种病痛到另外一种病痛，它们让你更清晰地看清楚人生的真相。的确，这些令人愤怒的病痛真实得让人没得话可说，但是你必须找出身体的病根。我看到你孤独的眼神里最真实的光亮。疼痛已经够多了，我们不能再糊涂的疼痛。好多人到死都得不到职业病的鉴定，它比蜀道更难。我们都是那只书体，在曲折惊险的山道间感受命运，从不予受力到开胸年份，我充满难以抑制的疼痛、愤怒。车间，在局，在党，在状况，在心，在车，在灵魂，在滚动，在冷却，在热存，在饲养，在切断，在克制，在贴标签。车窗站、农场站、跑床站、茶车站、新切入进站、粮食站、马达站、冷却进站、微风卡站、塑料布站、标签站、创可地站、南北路站、北直灯站、电线站、公开站、 5分钟时间上厕所的放心跳，2分钟的开水房扑面而来的胶水味、苯味、铁锈味、油腻味、汗味、体臭味、腐臭味，烧焦的包装袋，它们没得法翻越的水面，弯曲的、长条形的、折形的、平行的、方形的、薄的、厚的、圆形的、快的成品、半成品、修理品、报废品、零件、重复、堆叠、摆子、打包，他们听到轰、呲、噗、滋、呲、咚、咚咚、咚咚、咚。竹青，你或者我，在出现的洪流中，只是细小的流沙，被带往遥远的城市，接受陌生的风景，不管愿意不愿意，我们必须接受工厂的一切，在裹挟中从摇摆到改变，朝不可预知的方向流动。风在流浪中淬炼成风景了，生活已变成生下来就得活下去。破碎的道德风俗在陌生的工业区楼群消失了，你没得办法返回过去的模样，也没得办法把握住现实，剩下愤怒成为对真实的渴望。那些日子和口口交谈成为内心一小块的风景，我们不断向生活的深处前行，现实却嘲笑我们。我们原以为会走向更广阔的城市，却不幸走进狭小的胡同。5年前，我们在网络上交谈，偶尔相见，有相同的看法，却常常不一样。我们热爱世界，对庞大的事物有莫名的忧伤，这些意味啥子呢？立场偏左偏右的知识分子看法，他们似乎不是我们的身份啊。从乡村到城市的农民，好多时候周围的人和乐会觉得我们的争论有些诡异，是否不应该出自我们口中？我们讨论的应该是省子、发财、流水线。面对工友，我们被嘲笑了。对这些，我们报以微笑，却充满悲伤。2个办公室女工不关心办公室政治，勾心斗角，而对体制充满热忱，这本身是对生活的背叛。5年后，我们偶然相见，你已丧失对过去一切的兴趣，谈论香水、车辆、美容店、LV 皮包，生活总是令人期待。我们已被讲解得面目全非。或许，正如现在的你说的，对于现实，我们只有装着社会线，才能避免痛苦。这就是成长的改变。愚公被固定在卡住上的青春，时间张开巨大的手，明月在机台生锈，他疲倦乏力内心的凶险不流动，身体的气候崩溃，迷途的船时间的脆皮，塞满雨息，体内汹涌的活力，混乱的潮水跟随季节涨落。他坐在看流动的纸品和时间交错，顿时人快老了，10年像水一样流动。巨大的厌倦脑海中漂浮好多年，他手到螺丝一颗2颗转动，向左向右，让梦想和青春固定在某个地平。看到苍白的青春一路奔跑，从内陆乡村到沿海工厂，一直到美国的某个国家，疲倦和执念的疾病在后面飞步结束，卡在喉间，也在暗示到来的月经猛烈的特色。工厂远处的开发区，绿色的荔枝树被砍伐，身边的机器战斗，他揉了揉红肿的眼窝，将自个插在猛红流动制品间。 们滚动、摩擦、尖叫、呼唤。深夜4点的睡意从他的皮肤里生长，切割的、打磨的、洗撞的、撞击的声音，它们流动、行走、奔跑、停顿。深夜4点的睡意从他的肉体里生长，咒骂的、心脏的、哈欠的、疲倦的声音，它们混混纠缠、皎洁堆叠。深夜4点的睡意从他的骨头里生长。深夜4点，我目睹他的睡意长成树木，我目睹他的手指让机器咬掉半截，我目睹他的睡意让鲜血浇醒，我目睹他的哭泣，他的尖叫，我目睹我们的叹息无奈。然后声音重新响起，然后睡意重新生长，然后是沉默，是沉默，沉默。
Some with a few of the poems that Sylvia selected and translated and can now be found in this collection als IJzig zo stil. The Made in China Festival has invited Maghiel van Crevel from Leiden University, who specializes in Chinese poetry, to give a broader image of Chinese poetry from the 1980s onwards until today, and who will give you a better idea of what this battler poetry is about. Please welcome Maghiel van Crevel.
So thank you for coming today, and many thanks to the Made in China organisers for allowing me to be part of such a wonderfully rich programme. It's quite astonishing, actually, the things that we've seen in the days and weeks past and are about to see tomorrow as well. You've probably been wondering what you are looking at. I will be telling you about this in a minute. And of course, battler poetry is one of the many poetries that coexist in contemporary China, have coexisted for the last several decades. I'm switching on my stopwatch and desperately trying to continue this sentence without getting distracted, so I'll make sure not to sort of go over time. I'm about to manage this. Yes, I got it. And battler poetry is, as Nicky just indicated, a peculiar type of poetry, and there's a bit of cultural background to this that we can also talk about more during the Q&A later on. So I'll be focusing on this specific genre. Battler poetry is otherwise mostly known as migrant worker poetry. Nothing wrong with that, except that it's not a translation but an explanation, really. And this is about rural to urban migrants in China since the 1980s. We're talking about 300 million people. Right now, obviously, it's not as if every single one of those 300 million migrants writes poetry, but even if the percentage of people that do is minuscule, that still means a vast number of very active poets who are increasingly visible in the public realm in China and elsewhere. So, this phrase, made in China, has been used and abused for several decades by all kinds of parties, including cultural brokers like this particular festival, right, made in China. Very definitely a phrase that we can use to talk about battler poetry, and the surface that we've been sort of skating around on the screen here is called the Dagong Qiantu. That is what you see on the screen here. And that translates as Dagong Panorama, except that it doesn't translate because I've just used a Chinese word in English, right? Dagong Panorama. So what is Dagong? And you typically resort to strategies like this when a term or a phrase or a notion is difficult to translate, which is the case for Dagong. It means something like working for the boss. It means selling your labor, and it means facing a fundamental type of socio-economic insecurity, as in, will I have a job tomorrow? And if I'm not sure that I'm going to have a job tomorrow, would it be responsible for me to start a family? Will I have a job next month, next year, and so on and so forth? So this 打工前途, selling your labor panorama, working for the boss panorama, I like to call it the battler panorama, I'll have more to say about that in a minute, is about China in the 21st century. That's what it actually says above the banner there. And the artist is a cartoonist, the Chinese genre is called manhua, by the name of Wei Ke, who made this cartoon on the invitation of a bunch of people who were putting together a book, a landmark anthology of this poetry written by migrant workers, by precarious workers, and about migrant workers and precarious workers. Now here's the full image. It's very clever. It's actually part of a, let's say, a cartoonesque tradition in China where you sort of work entire worlds into a single cartoon like this. And what Wei Ke has done very cleverly is to work iconic places of the Dagonging person's life into this cartoon. Now, let me talk about this notion of the battler in English for a moment, and why I prefer translating Dagong or Dagongzhe, which means, or Dagongren, Dagongmei, Dagongzai, and words like that, into English by using the word battler. I was looking for a translation that would do justice to the source text, both in terms of the semantics, what does this actually mean, but also in terms of the linguistic register and the fact that we're looking for a colloquial expression, a very normal everyday word. And Dagong, these two characters in Chinese, they have absolutely zilch, nothing to do with the notion of migrant worker in English. Like I said, it's a good explanation, but it's not a translation. And then I stumbled, through the help of a friend, David Kelly, an Australian sinologist, on this word battler in Australian English, which is used for people who are also at the bottom of society, who are faced with socio-economic insecurity, who don't know if they're going to have work tomorrow or next month or next year. And the great thing about this word is that just like the Chinese source term, Dagong, it can be worn with pride, at the same time as sometimes being a pejorative notion. So, a bit of socio-historical background. I've mentioned this number of 300 million people who've drifted from the rural hinterland to the cities. And I should add, and this is probably not going to come to you as a surprise, certainly not after hearing and seeing Zheng Xiaoqiong's poetry, that many of these people work in 3D jobs, right? Dirty, dangerous, demeaning. The assembly line in factories, construction sites, sex work, courier services, anything that needs bodies for the boss in an expendable manner, so to speak. Now this story of migration is on the one hand a story of opportunity, because it does enable many people to leave a existence and a subsistence mired in poverty in the countryside, to move to the cities, to seek employment, and so on and so forth. And sometimes, to make enough money to go back to the village and build themselves a beautiful house or help their family and so on. But most of all, it is a story of hardship, of very difficult lives, of working overtime, of getting underpaid, of doing physically heavy, menial labor, of not having labor rights, not having residence rights, and so on and so forth. So Wei Ke has a number of these iconic places in the cartoon. Here we see the assembly line, a bit like, again, the pictures that we saw in the poetry recited by Zheng Xiaoqiong just now. Or a construction site with, the iconic towering crane and the iconic helmets worn by people in construction sites. And then here's a person who stands atop a high building and says, if you're not going to fix my back pay issues, as in I have not been paid, I'm going to jump, okay? And there's another person embodying sort of, the authorities or officialdom through the hat with a megaphone, they're saying, yeah, don't do this, let's talk about it. We zoom out, we see that we are looking at a luxury hotel that was probably built by the migrant workers, by the precarious workers, that are now, in the person of this single representative, actually standing on the roof and threatening suicide. And let me assure you that this is not some urban myth. This happens. People threaten suicide and people commit suicide in this way. Again, this is not in vast numbers, but it should be a very telling sort of cultural phenomenon. Then there is the railway station, which is, of course, the place where you arrive from the countryside in the city, where perhaps you leave the city again if your sojourn in the city has not worked out, if you want to travel to another city, or you go home to visit your family during the Chinese New Year, typically once a year for many of these people. And in the background we see a job market as well. Now, I mentioned just now that Wei Ke made this cartoon on the invitation of the editors of a book, and here you see the cover of the book. In Chinese it's called 1985到2005年中国打工诗歌精选, which means the best of China's battler poetry between 1985 and 2005. And this is a landmark publication in a tradition that, like I said before, has increasingly gained visibility inside China and elsewhere. And if we look at the history of this poetry, we see the earliest specimens probably in the 1980s, some graffiti on bathroom stalls, that kind of thing. Then if you move to the 1990s, you see this poetry getting published, for example, in factory newsletters, but also slowly in self-made, self-published journals, unofficial journals, journals that people sort of put together in their kitchen. And as the year 2000 arrives and the internet hits China in a big way, the smartphone arrives in around 2005, social media emerge, and so on and so forth, we see this poetry growing like there is no tomorrow, and we see the growth of a community around this poetry. This is when it starts being published on blogs, on the internet, on social media, and so on. And this is also when this poetry starts to cross over into official publications. So some of these poets, and Zheng Xiaoqiong is probably the best example, start gaining fame and their work starts to be published in official journals and books. And it starts to garner the attention of people outside China as well. Academics, labor activists, middle-class news media consumers, people interested in China, that sort of thing. What I'm going to do next is to show you 4 of these poets. I have pictures of them, and I'll read a poem by each of them and say something about their story, to give you a sense of how diverse and non-homogeneous this landscape really is. This is Xu Yizhi, and together with Zheng Xiaoqiong, whom we just saw on screen, he's probably China's best-known battler poet. And I'm going to start by reading a short poem by Xu Yizhi in English translation. A screw falls to the ground. A screw falls to the ground in this night of overtime. It drops straight down with a faint sound, and it won't attract anyone's attention. Just like some time ago, in a night just like this, a human being fell to the ground. That final issue of the human being falling to the ground has been remembered and memorized by many people, and one of the reasons is that Xu Yizhi lived only until the tender age of 24 when he committed suicide by jumping from a high-rise close to the Foxconn manufacturing plant in Shenzhen, where he was an employee. And what happens at that moment is that an explosion of publicity occurs in China and outside China. The death of the poet, or the death of the artist. And what happened at the time of that media explosion, that publicity explosion in 2014, was that this very powerful mix of the artist who dies young, and preferably by their own hand, combined with this notion, there's a romanticism here, but also some sort of voyeurism, which is potentially dehumanizing. This notion of, the iconic Chinese worker in the workshop of the world. And these three things together made for this media explosion. His story has been turned into a miniature for the story of the migrant workers in China. And if you ask me, which is sort of what you're doing by showing up tonight, I think that that is probably a little too easy. What do we really know about anybody's suicide, right? Other people commit suicide. This is a difficult topic to talk about. It is vulnerable. The person on the screen here is vulnerable posthumously. And yet, I believe that Shuichi's story has been sort of squeezed into a purely socio-economic narrative that sits there to explain the hard fate of Chinese migrant workers while the tragedy stands, and I'm not about to detract from it. I have my doubts. And this is what I mean by the politics of culture in the title of today's lecture. The second poet I'd like to introduce today is Ernst. And I'm going to start again with a poem. The poem actually features a rural urban migrant in the person of a girl from out of town. Okay? It's called Shopping Street. The girl from out of town sweeps the street at dawn, and early passers-by heave a sigh when they see her. Such a young girl, what a shame. The girl from out of town sweeps the street at dusk, and late-hour loafers heave a sigh when they see her. The middle-aged woman has lost her job. She has parents and children to provide for. The middle-aged woman cannot get by. The middle-aged woman brings a gift to the street office, and the girl from out of town is now gone. The middle-aged woman starts doing the sweeping. The middle-aged woman sweeps and heaves a sigh for herself. The kid in jail has served his time, is released, and returns to this old street that raised him. The people in the neighborhood grow uneasy. Shouldn't let him hang out all day with nothing to do. If he can't make a living, he might just start robbing us again. Come on, let's all do something about it. From then on, day in, day out, that big bad kid sweeps the street, and the passers-by spit at him, full of contempt. A police car drives right by his side, and the kid ducks away in spite of himself. He steals a sideways glance and sees two women criminals inside the car. One is the girl from out of town for prostitution. The other is the middle-aged woman for being her pimp. Now, we don't really know if the girl from out of town entered into sex work, and if so, how she did so and why she did so. We don't know if the middle-aged woman was her pimp. It might be that the police felt like rounding up the usual suspects, or that they've had these labels slapped on them one way or another. So this poem is not just about the social injustice that has to do with labour and migration in China, but it's also about abuse of power, and as such it is about political authorities. Now the point I'd like you to take away from this, and from Muzhao's story, is that Muzhao is known as China's first openly gay poet. And perhaps because of this is one of the things that he said about this himself in interviews and in his writings, he's not really visible as a battler poet, as a migrant worker poet, as a poet of precarious labour, even though he started writing about this stuff when most of the poets that became famous later for being battler poets hadn't started writing about this particular subject matter. So what you can see here, among other things, in the Chinese context, and I'll return to that later on, is that poetry somehow connects different places in the margins of society. This could be political dissidence. I haven't talked about that today, but we can talk about it in the Q&A. It could be subalternity, right? Socio-economic insecurity, not having a voice, as in the case of the precarious workers and the migrant workers who live at the bottom of society. And it could be about queerness, right? Because Muzhao publishes his poetry in unofficial journals and books. The third poet I'd like to introduce to you today is Xiaoqiong. And again, I'll start with a poem by Xiaoqiong in English translation. It is called Debts, Dai in Chinese, as in the money that you owe other people, not just money. You owe the everyday happiness, you owe the dusk of dawn, you owe the dream of future, you owe your friend an expectation. You owe freedom your dignity, you owe the flower a dewdrop, you owe your youth a craziness, you owe your family an aspiration. You owe the sky a pair of wings, you owe the sea a teardrop, you owe the earth a seed, you owe the rain a rainbow. You owe the sun a brilliance, you owe the moon a tenderness, you owe the stars an upward look, you owe your lover an eternity. But it's just that fate owes you fairness. Xiaoqiong is one of those people who left high school because at age 14, 15, his parents could no longer afford the school fees. And so he got on a train, went south from Henan province, which is where a lot of the migrant workers traveling south come from, and ended up in a very sort of shady job placement scheme, and for the next 12 or 14 years basically job hopped and city hopped from one assembly line in one factory to another. Now, what is special about Xiaoqiong, in addition to many other things, is that he's rock and roll, right? He was crazy about rock music from a very early age. He connected through social media in all sorts of ways with all kinds of icons, musical, cultural icons from various places in the world, including poets like Allen Ginsberg, singer-songwriters like Bob Dylan, the Rolling Stones, and he's actually wearing a t-shirt that says the Beatles in this picture, which I took in 2017, I think. And so in Xiaoqiong's story, we see a number of interesting things. One of these is that when he reflects on his own life in autobiographical essays, what he says is actually that he was so much into writing poetry, often in the form of song lyrics, that he neglected to sort of look after himself in terms of making enough money to be able to start a family. Finding yourself perhaps steady work after this sort of non-steady, insecure work in the factory. Basically didn't take care of himself. And then he got in touch with a bunch of people who were also into rock music. And the connection is very interesting because these people were based in Pitun, northeast of Beijing, and northeast of the capital of the People's Republic of China, where there is a non-governmental organization, an NGO called the Migrant Workers' Home. And what these people do is to try and advance labor rights, basically. But they do this through what they call cultural education, 文化教育 in Chinese. And so this means things like playing music. So the calling card of this NGO is a folk rock band, which, a bit like Bob Dylan, is always on tour. And they've been going at it for close to a quarter century. These were people who arrived in Beijing in the very late 1990s and started this band, which has changed its name, I don't know, 15 times in the course of all this time, and traveled around China, playing usually at construction sites and places like that for precarious workers. Their lyrics are very directly about the fate of China's precarious workers. And this NGO also has a literature group that has been run by one of the volunteers since 2014. So, for the last 8 years, these people have been writing literature. They invite volunteer lecturers, academics, cultural people to come and speak to them, and then they do their writing. So Xiaoqiong got in touch with these people through a rock and roll connection, a rock singer that he had contacted on social media. And the next thing he knew, he's actually relocated in 2016 to Pitun, became a part of the NGO, found more or less steady work there as well, and joined the literature group and became a published poet. So again, a very different story. And the fourth poem is one that you know, because you've just seen her read her poetry, and we're actually going to hear a poem that she wrote just now in Chinese, and that we saw in Sylvia's Dutch translation, in English translation here. Woman worker, youth fixed to a workstation. Time's giant beak yawns. Moonlight on the machine turns to rust, exhausted, dim, turbid. The peril in her heart gurgling, flowing by. The body's cliffs collapse. Mud and crushed stone shards of time clog up the rivers, surging in a woman's body. The tide in disarray, out of sync with the seasons. She sits in her seat, the products flowing by interlock with time, swallow it down so quickly. Grown old, 10 years have flowed by like water, a giant wariness wells up in her mind. For many years she has stood guard over the screws, one screw, two screws, turn to the left, to the right, fixing her dreams and her youth to a product. Watching her pallid youth running always, from the rural backland to a city on the seaboard, then to a store shelf in the US. Exhaustion and occupational disease accumulate in her lungs, stick in her throat. Her period no longer on time, her coughing fierce. In the development zone, beyond the factory, the lychee trees are felled. The machines around her are shaking. She kneads her eyes red and swollen, then takes herself and sticks it in between the products flowing by. Zheng Xiaoqiong is in various ways the exception that confirms the rule. She's a woman, for one thing, and poetry in China, as in many other places, is a very deeply male-dominated scene. So she sort of, broken ranks there and made her way to the position of being basically a figurehead, basically being the face of China's battle of poetry. Another way in which she is an exception to the rule is that her writing has actually brought her socio-economic security, that her writing has actually lifted her out of a precarious existence. She's obviously extremely talented. She's also extremely dedicated. Just recently, I've seen new material published online. That is the letters that she wrote in 2002 to a fellow Sichuanese, Sichuan is a province in central China, fellow Sichuanese poet back in Sichuan after she had migrated to Dongguan in southeast China, sending him money and asking him to send her books of poetry and journals to learn being a poet. It's astonishingly impressive. And so Zheng has actually become something like a cultural official, because first she started publishing in official journals and books, then she became a member of the China Writers Association, then she became a member of the nationwide Federation of Writers and Artists, and when I first interviewed her in 2016, she'd just come back from a trip to Beijing. We were then in Guangdong. She'd just come back from a trip to Beijing where she had attended the 5-yearly Congress of the Federation of Writers and Artists in the People's Republic of China, where Xi Jinping had just given a speech. So, it goes to show. And I guess that what I want to bring out by this final example, aside from the fact that Zheng Xiaoqiong is the face of battle of poetry in China, is the complexity of the force field that surrounds this poetry. It's not just poets, it's not just poetry readers, it's not just critics and publishers, right, ordinary readers, it's also the government, it is cultural authorities, it is, foreign labour activists, it is Chinese labour activists, it is middle-class media consumers who somehow enjoy this feel-good thing of reading about this horrible existence of people working on construction sites, trying to scrape by making money for their families back home, while endangering their physical lives, that kind of thing. A lot going on here. What I'd like to turn to now, after these examples, is a couple of big questions about this poetry. So let me give you the first one. I didn't make this up. It's a question that people ask all the time, okay? I didn't make it up. Is this poetry that happens to be about labor, or is it really labor activism that just happens to take the form of poetry? Okay? Now, I'm an academic, so, an academic will now say, so I'm going to say that, this is a false dichotomy, right? This is not a real choice. This is not a real opposition. This can be poetry, and it can be about labor, and it can be labor activism, and yes, it can take the form of poetry. So, I'm a bit worried that I'm going into sermon mode. This happens when I teach as well, so I'll try and tone it down a little bit. But I'd like you to take away from this that you should never feel compelled to choose between this being poetry that happens to be about migrant labour or this being labour activism that happens to be about poetry. Right? Just refuse. So, we've seen and heard 4 different voices, each of which is very accomplished in their own way, right? So this is a point about diversity. It's not as if we can take a very deterministic position and say, okay, well, yeah, there's labour migration, and then there is adversity and hardship, and then, you add a couple of people to the mix, and then out comes a particular kind of poetry. Right? These people handle their subject matter in very different ways. And of course, we can observe generalizable patterns, that's not a problem. But, remember the point about diversity. Secondly, let's think about cultural specificity. Poetry has incredible power in China. It is, apologies for this, sort of hardly very original metaphor, it is part of China's cultural DNA. Poetry happens in many places. It happened in antiquity, it's still happening today. It happens as a social practice. It is a way of speaking truth to power. It is an honourable pastime. Nobody's going to think it weird if you write poetry. Nobody's going to think it weird in China if you want to practice the art of poetry, as distinct from a vision where poetry is some sort of divinely granted natural gift. It might be both, who knows? But just to sort of drive that point home, because we're going to need it down the line. Now, I want to illustrate this point about the cultural specificity, the power of poetry in China, by showing you an example of an unofficial poetry publication. I mentioned this before. So this is the kind of thing, it's a little bit like, Soviet Russian samizdat, which literally means self-publishing, right? If your stuff doesn't really make it through the channels that are available for official publishing, you're going to do it yourself, right? From your back garden or your kitchen table, which is actually a metaphor that is used in this way in the West. I'm not quite sure where the West is as well. So this one is called Da Gong Shiren, which means the Da Gong poet or the battler poet, and it has Zheng Xiaoqiong's poetry in it. And again, you see that this phenomenon of unofficial publishing in China links different marginalities, academic, different places in the margins, right? Queerness, subalternity in socio-economic terms, political dissidence. So, with apologies for blowing my own horn and the horn of my institution, Leiden University, I'd like to draw your attention, if you're interested in this sort of stuff, to a digital collection that is online, open access. If you Google Leiden digital poetry, you'll get that, or unofficial poetry journals, whatever. And here you'll find a large number of these unofficial journals, including migrant worker poetry or battler poetry journals, available to all. Why are we doing this? Well, that's because of a big bad paradox. And the paradox is that on the one hand, unofficial journals are what you could call physically small. Right? You do the stuff at your kitchen table. So maybe this journal has 50 issues or 100 or maybe 500 or maximally 1,000. But China's a big country. Right? So what is 1,000 issues? Now this stuff travels like a house on fire. People pass it on through personal networks and it gets read widely. That is the other element of the paradox, because while it is physically small, it is hugely influential. These unofficial poetry publications are often where the sort of, boundary pushing happens, where the next new big thing emerges, etc. So in a sense, you could read this intermezzo on these journals as an illustration of the power of poetry as a meme, the cultural sibling of the gene in Chinese cultural tradition. And we do this project working together with the community, with the poets and the editors, obviously, not just for reasons of copyright, but also because this is typically a subject matter that you want to do collaborative work on in the academy. Let's move on to our next big question. How can we place battler poetry? What is it like? How about we think about this in terms of family resemblance for a moment? And I'll give you three, relatives of this poetry that we'll compare it to. And these three are workers' poetry from the high socialist era in the People's Republic of China. This is basically what you see on the screen. This is a journal from 1950 called Gongren Shige, or Workers' Poetry. Not incidentally, currently, as we speak today, there is an unofficial journal in China called Gongren Shige as well. So this is one poetry we could compare it to. Another poetry is, for example, the English language traditions in workers' poetry in the UK and the US. Right? These are strong traditions. And a third example is Dalit poetry from India, untouchables, okay? Poetry by and about untouchables, Dalit. Now, yes, there's a great deal of similarity. For example, all of these poetries, including battler poetry, are about identification, about finding a place under the sun, about community building through poetry. They're all about social concern and social aspirations, the desire to effect social change to varying degrees. This makes them activist to various degrees as well. They're about resistance and anti-elitism as well. And fourth, they have varying relations, but always some sort of relation to political authority. At the same time, workers' poetry from the high socialist era in the People's Republic of China, 1950s, 60s, a little bit in the 1970s, the worker was a dignified political subject, was somebody with tremendous political respect. Whereas, and I'm painting a bit of a caricature, but I don't think I'm going overboard, today's precarious workers in China are basically neoliberal waste material. And of course, this is not just the case in China, by the way, except that, in terms of absolute numbers and in terms of the absolutely crucial position of China in the food chain of global capitalism, we might want to pay attention. What about working class poetries in the US and the UK? What might be an interesting difference with battler poetry? Well, poetries in the UK and the US, in this particular context, have often thrived when there was strong unionization. Strong unions that could make or break a company, or a country. And unionization is out of reach for Chinese workers today. It is not allowed. It is allowed in name, but that's lip service. And what about Dalit poetry, this poetry of and about the untouchables in India? I think there is clearly a stronger element of actual explicit political protest in that poetry. And again, this is something that might be there in Chinese battler poetry if it weren't for the fact that the government will not allow this. That takes us to another big question. What is the take of the Chinese political authorities on battler poetry? During my fieldwork interviews with poets, with editors, with academics, with poetry readers, with people out and about, one thing I found is that nobody harbors any illusion about the palpable presence of censorship, not just in literature and art in the People's Republic of China across the board, but also for battler poetry. In other words, it is not as if this poetry is somehow exempt from censorship. For example, if this literature, there's not just poetry, there's also fictional and non-fictional prose, there is the occasional theatrical production, but poetry is the most prominent genre. If this poetry touches on the sheer horror of working in so-called black factories, which are factories that have nothing that would even remotely resemble labor rights, sensible contracts, safety conditions and stuff like that, it's just not going to get published. It might get published unofficially, it might be fleetingly present on the web, but it's certainly not going to get published officially. So the government is a censor, just like the government is a censor for literature and art across the board. Now mind you, and this would be an interesting thought experiment, in as much as you and we, perhaps many of us, some of us, have been socialized to start frothing at the mouth when we hear the word censorship, consider for a moment that there might be an argument in which censorship is a moral duty for a government. And this is very much how this works in China and how it has worked for thousands of years. A moral duty for the government to protect its citizens from harmful influences. Now, trigger warning, I'm going to give you an example that is shocking, right? Hence the trigger warning. But the argument isn't ludicrous. The argument can make a lot of sense. And the example I'm going to give you is child pornography. Right? Few people would say, well, freedom of speech, come on, let's all do child pornography on the internet, right? So there is an argument there, and it becomes politically very interesting to sort of see to what extent you would like to empathize with a government that interferes with literature and art. I'm not positioning myself in any particular way here, I just want to sort of put that out there. At the same time as being a censor, the government is a sponsor of this literature as well. Witness, for example, the career of Zheng Xiaoqiong, but also other official publications, conferences on battle of poetry, etc. And so my takeaway here would be that I hope we can steer away from easy black and white binaries that say, okay, we have grassroots cultural production, this is resistance, and then here's the state, and state culture is always going to be oppressive. It doesn't work that way. Xiaohai, this bloke who ended up in the migrant workers' home in that NGO, he was invited by the Beijing cultural apparatus, the Laoshi Institute for Literature in Beijing, to take a 2-week course on poetry composition. And I interviewed him about this later on and said, how was it? What did you think? And he said, it was the best 2 weeks of my life. I didn't have to worry about food and drink, and I could concentrate on poetry. Right? What more do you want? It was beautiful. So just to sort of get us away from the black and white easy oppositions of how this stuff works. Next big question. Here's Sylvia's and Zheng Xiaoqiong's book. Does this poetry translate? Well, obviously it does, but you know what I'm saying. And if it does, what sort of questions does this raise? What happens? Now, tellingly, in this book on the screen here that every single one of you in the audience is going to buy later on tonight, there is an afterword, and we know that poetry is about words and it is about worlds, right? It's about words and it's about worlds. And the afterword, written by Sylvia, starts with the world. Just like my talk today started with the world. 300 million migrants, okay? Yes, that is typical of this poetry. At the same time, we've seen the diversity of the voices, and I have implored you not to feel compelled to choose between poetry and something else, right? This can travel 2 ways. Here's another translation. This is a bit of a landmark book published in 2016. Iron Moon, Xu Li Zhi, is actually on the cover. The Foxconn factory is in the back looking rather hellish. And this is also, these are by Eleanor Goodman, great translations by the way. And this is also a project that shows very, very clearly that what is at play in the translation of Battle of Poetry is not just an aesthetic impulse, but also very much a moral impulse. And I'm personally very interested in what happens when the aesthetic and the moral impulse get entangled in translation work. And I've recently done a piece on battle poetry in Dutch for Poëziecentrum Gent. And in that piece, I sort of went into that and asked myself a question. Said, you know, what do you do if you feel that the source text is according to what you were taught to like? Unsophisticated, perhaps? Do you make this a better poem? Well, better according to whom? Right? Whose aesthetics are at play here? And that is obviously a question that raises other questions like, you know, if you are part of a cultural elite, like me, like Sylvia, are you even fit to translate this poetry? Well, maybe we could turn it around and say, well, if the author isn't part of a cultural elite, but you are under the obligation to translate this poetry so as to raise awareness and to work as an ally. You know, and we could go on and ask, you know, 10 more questions like this of translation. Here's my final question. Why should we read this poetry? Well, I sort of hope that by this point in the lecture, you know, you were going to say in unison, duh, okay? But you didn't do that, so I'm still going to tell you. First of all, this is about the nexus of social experience and aesthetics, and that is not a problem. If it is a problem at all, it's a problematic, probably. It's an issue. It's wonderful. It's a great question that we aren't going to solve anytime soon. Social experience and aesthetics and the relations between them are fascinating and they are important politically. Secondly, I said, whose aesthetics is this about? Right? It can be exciting to not think about it just from a moral point of view, but also from an intellectual point of view and from an affective point of view. What do you feel? And how do you feel about trying to make room for an aesthetic that is not your own? I'm not assuming anything about any of your individual aesthetics. I don't know you, right? But it might be that they're not all the same. And thirdly, poetic voice is a fundamental expression of humanity whose manifestations are remarkably diverse. And again, we might as well be paying attention. So I've zoomed out a little bit for this final picture. You can see what the people are actually saying here. This sums up the story of opportunity and hardship in the migrant workers. The conversation on the left reads, 小姑娘，我带你去深圳工作吧，工资很高. So, little girl, let me take you to Shenzhen for a job. The wages are really high. And the conversation on the right reads, 我要回家，请好心里帮助. Right? I want to go home. Please help me from the bottom of your heart. Thank you.